In this video, we're breaking down all 22 collectible tarot cards scattered about the map in Cyberpunk 2077. These cards, / pieces of wall graffiti, crop up after the heist as bizarre figments of V's imagination, or maybe something a little more. And, as you probably guessed, there's actually a fair bit more to them than simply a classic video game collectible. Not only do these cards accurately foreshadow all the game's potential endings ahead of time, but also each individual card can give us further insight into certain characters and events in the game based on where we find them. So, without further ado, let's take a look at all of them to figure out just what the hell they mean. So, first in the deck, we have the Fool card, and this essentially represents V at the start of the game, at the beginning of our journey to become whatever we become by the end, with its description reading, quote, "The Fool is everyone, including you and me. Each step he takes on his journey feels like stepping into a brave new world. Ultimately, the journey will change him, but as the card shows, he's a trustworthy lad whose tireless hope drives him towards his goal." End quote. Now, before we analyze all of these in detail, I just want to say that these descriptions are all very open-ended, deliberately so. If you thought hard enough, they could probably be interpreted to mean whatever you wanted them to. Whilst the game does accurately predict all the possible futures with them, I think it's more what they tend to symbolically represent that's worth looking into here. So, in the picture, the Fool can be seen almost blindly stepping over a ledge, and I think this represents V's fearlessness to step into the unknown and just face whatever comes next. Indeed, we as players have a natural tendency to accept any quests or jobs which come our way, completing them without question in the hopes of discovering more about the world. And V certainly has a lot of hope. After all, the odds of surviving this thing between us and Johnny are remarkably slim, but even still, V does everything in their power to press forward and save their own life, simply because there's a shred of hope that they might succeed. Also, in both the Aldecaldo and Devil endings, the Fool is always the card that Misty will pick first if you accept her reading. And here's what she has to say about it.
The Fool.
What a surprise.
Let's dig deeper to find its meaning here. The Fool symbolizes the start of a journey, the announcement of something new. It's the inner child, curious of the world, but also naive and reckless. Sounds a lot like the V I first met.
So, Misty 2 confirms this is V earlier in the game, and from the fact that this one crops up literally outside V's apartments, I think everything points to this being the case, and the Fool then goes hand in hand with the next card on the list. The Magician then represents Johnny, reading, quote, "The Magician is the card of self-confidence and adapting to situations through intellect and sheer will. The Magician is a schemer who always has one last trick up his sleeve, who, despite everything, manages to stay afloat and remain in control of his own destiny." End quotes. So Johnny is certainly an adaptable individual. After all, look at the friendship arc he and V go through after this particularly heated encounter in the beginning. Johnny was understandably pretty pissed off at being trapped inside someone else's body, and the one last trick up his sleeve sounds a little reminiscent of when Johnny pulls out the Don't Fear the Reaper ending, though again, that could just be my interpretation. Now, interestingly, when Misty selects this card during her reading, it's always reversed, which actually fits Johnny even better.
The Magician. A person of great talent and charisma. A leader.
Sounds like Johnny.
The card is reversed. That can mean a tendency toward addiction, mental instability.
Oh, okay, definitely Johnny. He has one great disturbance.
Yeah, I think this part is very important to the Magician, because after all, Johnny is not a totally infallible wise man whom we should always 100% listen to. Much of the time, his advice comes from a place of high emotion, of hate towards the corporations, or a desire to satiate his own curiosity. I'd say on the whole, going off every piece of Johnny advice won't land you in a bad place, but will result in you missing things which could potentially be something you want to do. Saving Takamura springs to mind, or trusting the Netwatch agent over the Voodoo Boys. Granted, Johnny is right there, the guy is technically playing us, but so is everyone in that situation. There's not exactly a harmless way out of that one. Equally, the knives pointing towards us in this picture could be representing the fact that Johnny is slowly killing V, driving these tools of death slowly towards us. Or it could just represent Johnny's more destructive influence, whilst at the same time being a sage advice giver. Also, in the Temperance ending, one of the 3 cards Misty draws during the credits is the Magician. Again, I suppose as representing Johnny, and we'll look at that a bit more alongside the other cards in a little bit. Only thing though, which doesn't quite fit here, is the fact that this card is found just outside Lizzie's, a place I'd more associate with Judy or Evelyn than Johnny. So maybe the magician is also meant to represent Judy as well. After all, she does, to be fair, always remain in control of her destiny, mostly by leaving Night City one way or another. Again, these things have multiple interpretations, but the next one does seem a little more certain. Now, this one, based on the location and the person we meet there, clearly points towards Hanako, or rather perhaps serves as a forewarning against what Hanako appears to represent. Reading, quote, "The High Priestess is a card of mystery. It shows how all our secrets hang by a delicate thread and the struggle between common sense and intuition. The High Priestess symbolizes the cold, calm waters as well as the mysteries hidden in their depths." End quote. Now, the white figure is definitely reminiscent of Hanako herself, and I think perhaps the outstretched but not visible hands warn us about Hanako's unclear intentions. Those arms could be open for a hug, offering support, aid as it claims to give, but equally they could be holding knives, ready to stab us in the back the second we get close enough. We just can't see. And indeed, thinking about the devil ending where she embraces Yorinobu before slipping that biochip inside his head, this does feed into that. Equally, here's what Misty has to say about it.
The High Priestess. Do not seek simple answers. Be open to your intuition, your subconscious, your dreams.
Do not seek simple answers. And which ending is the simplest to obtain? The only one which can be unlocked without completing any side quests? Well, of course, it's the devil. So yes, Hanako is a mystery, seemingly cold on the surface, but with depths that we never really get to dive into. Depths which in this case turn out to be fairly malevolent. The Empress is found just at the base of the stairs by the entrance to the afterlife, so you'd immediately assume that it's in some way tied to Rogue. Let's have a read about what it represents. Quote, "The Empress is a card of femininity and motherhood. She is authoritative, knows what she wants, and exhibits refinement and sensuousness. The Empress symbolizes creativity and growth, and instructs us not to diminish our unconscious impulses, but to trust our intuition." End quote. Okay, so I'd say the first part of that can definitely be used to describe Rogue. Refined and authoritative whilst coming across as somewhat maternal. She's also, literally, a mother, after having a kid with Santiago. As for creativity and growth, well, Rogue is equally a mastermind at concocting daring fixer missions. We need look no further than the plan she concocts for assaulting Arasaka Tower at short notice for that one. What's more, we know from doing some of Rogue's smaller gigs that she'll often go out of her way to help the everyday citizens of Night City, like having us take out this guy who endangers the rights of workers. Clearly, a woman who knows what she wants with a maternal and caregiving nature, albeit one who isn't afraid to screw over anyone who gets in her way, just like this guy in the bottom corner of the card. I think ultimately though, what the Empress is telling us is that Rogue will fight to the bitter end for you, literally, if your goals are aligned. Now, the Emperor may sound very similar in name to the Empress, but don't be fooled. These two have some pretty important differences. Yes, they both represent some form of great power and strength, but with the Emperor, well, let me just read the excerpt. Quote, "The Emperor represents patriarchal control and is pleased with the authority and power he possesses to shape the future. The Emperor makes the rules and enforces them for the common good. But prestige has its dark sides. The Emperor is dominating and ruthless and will climb over a mountain of bodies to achieve his aim." End quote. Now, who does that sound like? Indeed, no doubt the Emperor is supposed to point towards Saburo, and this is made even more obvious by the fact it's located just outside Konpeki Plaza. Yeah, it's pretty on the nose, this one, except I think just maybe it could extend to include Yorinobu too. Now, whilst I'm very much of the opinion that Yorinobu is on the whole a pretty decent guy, in fact I've done a whole video on that, it's also clear, in that last bit especially, that this could entirely describe Yorinobu. He literally does leave a mountain of bodies behind with his little coup to achieve his aim, and I think the illustration of this ties the two figures together even more. Whilst yes, it's obviously a reference to imagery of the Emperor from 40k, I think it could also be a nod to Saburo digitizing his mind, and using that to re-inhabit the body of his son in the devil ending. Now, this next one is found down in a tunnel in Japantown, right by where we and Takemura meet with Oda for the first time. And I think it can be used to describe both of those characters, saying, quote, "The Hierophant symbolizes a respect for tradition. It represents one who tries to maintain the established order, even though their very character is shaped by it. The Hierophant places his faith in institutions, for the alternative is pure chaos. Only by placing faith in order can he draw strength." End quote. It's an indication of just how strong both these figures' loyalties are to the corporation. Takemura to Saburo, and Oda to Hanako. Both of them know literally no other way to go about life than to follow these structures. It's literally ingrained into them so deeply that even if they thought about leaving, they just wouldn't know how to exist. What's also interesting though, is when Misty mentions the reverse Hierophant.
But watch out. A reversed Hierophant lurks in the darkness. He brings crisis, both in life and authority, rebellion and fanaticism. He is a grave threat.
Personally, I think again that this could be a reference to Johnny, because indeed he is a grave threat to us, literally wiping our mind from the inside. I don't know, honestly, again, these are so open to interpretation. It could be Yorinobu, although I'd say he's only a grave threat should we choose the devil ending. It's a tough one, though what I am certain of is the location of the graffiti, warning us that Takemura will ultimately seek to maintain established order by literally helping to bring back his master. Now, this is a nice one. The Lovers is found during one of the more wholesome quests in the game, Blistering Love, where we let Johnny take Rogue on a date to the drive-in theatre, and behind the screen that these two literal lovers are watching sits the graffiti of two grotesque skeletons that appear to be tonguing. Yeah, maybe not so nice. Let's read what it has to say. Quote, "The Lovers is the card of dichotomies. It points to contradictions that clash within each of us and of the challenge of striking a balance between two extremes. The Lovers is also the card of dilemmas, like the fool who stands at the crossroads unable to make his choice." End quote. Okay, so from that description, I'd guess the Lovers may be a little bit less about traditional love and more about finding balance. And in fact, the Blistering Love quest also doubles as a key moment wherein Johnny and V are able to strike that balance, with V surrendering control to Johnny for a time so that he can fulfill a regret from his life. And whilst the location of the graffiti points more towards these traditional kinds of love, the crossroad bit does factor in too during Misty's reading at the start of the Aldecaldo ending.
The Lovers.
Something that doesn't give me the chills. Finally.
Balance, friendship, love. Though it can also mean difficult choices ahead.
Ain't that the truth?
Indeed, this ending does again result in us leaving Night City with our lover, potentially, but also it's an ending where we have to make the choice as to who gets V's body. This is of course a choice present during the Rogue and Reaper endings too, but we don't get to wait and have our tarot read for those. And since V and Johnny are both technically dead when they enter Mikoshi, maybe these two skeletons have more of a literal representation. Now, the Chariot crops up just outside Tom's diner, where we meet with Takemura at the start of Act 2 and have our first civilized conversation with Johnny.
Changed my mind. Don't want you dead anymore.
And, from what I can tell, the Chariot kind of signifies the beginning of our journey together with Johnny, with quote, "The Chariot is always charging ahead, despite being pulled by its steeds in opposite directions. The rider who steers it constantly reins in the light and dark sides of the soul with the help of reason. To ride the Chariot is to experience highs and lows, ups and downs." End quote. I mean, that last bit, damn, that's insightful. I mean, experiencing highs and lows, how many people does that happen to? Oh, right, yeah, literally everyone. Okay, well, in that case, I can only infer again that the Chariot signifies the journey through the game itself, with the reining in of the light and dark, I suppose, being to temper the relationship between Johnny and V, with reason, in this case, being sheer survival. But Misty has another take on this.
The Chariot. You're ready for change, ready to seek the truth about yourself. And to help, you'll have someone from your family?
So here, I reckon Misty is probably referring to any of the endings outside of the devil. Indeed, for the rest of this particular reading, she selects the reversed sun, strength, and a reversed magician, which she also makes an interesting point on.
Strength. Strength of will, discipline, and courage will always be rewarded, but not necessarily at your destination, as the reversed magician shows. Perhaps the path itself is what's important? And will help you overcome your fear?
Well, with the revelation that we come to in any of those endings, yeah, it renders the destination somewhat pointless in terms of achieving the goal we set out for. Also, Misty chooses the Chariot in the credits for the Aldecaldo ending, and I suppose there too, it signifies the start of yet another journey well beyond Night City. But the first character we meet who introduces us to the Aldecaldos is of course Panam, and right by the spot where we first introduce ourselves to her is the tarot graffiti for strength, signifying, quote, the card of resilience. It is associated with determination, bravery, and internal struggle. One must have dedication in order to overcome obstacles and reach one's goal. Strength is about physical prowess and spiritual fortitude, the power that must be unleashed to achieve the impossible, end quote. So there's no denying that Panam is one of the strongest and most resilient characters whom we'll meet in the game, and I think that card was simply placed here to represent that, mostly. Now remember, these cards weren't made up for the game, they represent the actual tarot deck that's existed for hundreds of years apparently, so I feel like many of them are plonked in a place which does just make sense if we can infer the meaning. But yeah, if I were to read into it, I'd say this is foreshadowing the incredible ally we're about to meet, whether or not it becomes something romantic. Equally, Misty draws strength for the credits of the Sun ending, the one which I suppose embodies Dex's blaze of glory the most. Found down by the chapel in Pacifica next, the Hermit represents an isolated individual, and whilst we first could assume that's talking about the Voodoo Boys, I'm fairly certain it isn't, thanks to the description and a point raised by Misty. It reads, quote, the Hermit is a card of self-imposed isolation. It represents an escape from the hustle and bustle of the city, a turning away from the constant newness toward ye olde ways. For the Hermit, solitude is the road to the sublime, a road that is taken not with great bounds and strides, but with small, concentrated steps, end quote. Okay, so maybe the ye olde ways bit could be representative of the Voodoo Boys, but at the same time, they're a pretty untrustworthy force to deal with, which makes me think of someone different when Misty says this.
The Hermit. In solitude, he discovers the truth about himself and the world. From this, he draws strength, his lantern cutting through the darkness. Could be you, or someone who shows you kindness.
And that got me thinking, who else do we meet during the Voodoo Boys quests? Well, this is where we get in contact with Old Cunningham, somebody entirely cut off from the rest of the world, existing beyond the Black Wall in a way that we can't even conceive of. Her insane abilities offering a lantern that lights the way amidst the darkness. And despite my reservations as to her true intentions, something I'll cover in another video, you cannot deny she does indeed show us some form of kindness. And I think the artwork for this one as well just looks really cool. Wheel of Fortune means, quote, change is coming. One's destiny could turn out for the better or the worse, yet it also bears the promise of new possibilities. The wheel reminds us that nobody remains at the top forever, but also that not every situation is hopeless, end quote. I think in our case, fortunately, the lack of hopelessness part is the more relevant one. After all, Wheel of Fortune crops up at the Sunset Motel, not only again one of the first places we start forming our relationship with Panam, but also the place we return to with Anders Hellman. It's crucial, in more ways than one, to taking our hopeless situation and turning it back around into something which we can actually come out of, either by relying on Hellman in the Devil ending, God forbid, or by relying on our newfound friends to help lead a monumental infiltration of Arasaka Tower. Equally, it's the place we go to after the float parade, where Hanako relays us her offer via proxy. Again, a huge piece of hope, depending on how you look at it, and an apparent way out of a terrible situation. But, in that case, a huge trap. The wheel then, as is described, is not always entirely fortuitous. This next one is found just outside the underground Scav complex where we go with Judy to rescue Evelyn, which I think at first glance is a tad ironic. See, Justice is described as, quote, the card of conflict resolution. It proclaims the need for order to see through lies and deceit and a return to the natural state of affairs. Justice implies a just sentence, but also due process, end quote. So I suppose we get justice over the Scavs who've wronged Evelyn, and yes, we do have to go through a due process in order to get here, first with Cloud, and then fingers and whatnot, but at the same time, not too long after this, Evelyn dies. Not exactly a just sentence, but maybe then this is more representative of Judy and her questline after this, what with taking over Clouds and making it a safer place for the dolls. Except there too, it's not exactly a happy ending however we play it. Side with Maiko and Cloud stays much the same, stick with Judy and Tom dies. I actually really like the artwork for this one, with the shoulders actually serving as weighing scales, and I guess what I'd ultimately glean from this then is how our decisions don't always wind up resulting in wholly good or bad, but rather some good and some bad in varying measures. The Hanged Man is found up in the oil fields, atop a water tower directly overlooking the place where Johnny's unmarked grave allegedly is. It reads, quote, "The Hanged Man is the card of sacrifice. It says that a price must be paid in order to achieve enlightenment. The Hanged Man's forsakenness opens the path for rebirth into a new life, though this path is wrought with pain, suspended in time, and ultimately ends in death." End quote. Sounds again a lot like Johnny, and I think this perhaps is put here in particular to represent Silverhand's old life. He did, after all, sacrifice himself in bringing down Saka Tower, and eventually was reborn as an engram. But before that, his consciousness was trapped inside Mikoshi, suspended in time. Misty also draws both the Hanged Man and the Magician, both cards associated with Johnny in the Temperance ending, saying this:
Those are not good cards, V. They're really bad. There's something like death, but not quite. Take care of yourself, okay? I hope to hear from you soon.
As for the ending in death part of the Hanged Man, well, regardless of what you do, whichever ending you choose, it does end in death, V's or Johnny's. And yes, whilst either of the other of them do go with Alt beyond the Blackwall, the change in what they ultimately become is undoubtedly large enough to signify some form of death. You see, death in this case is represented not necessarily as the end, but as, quote, "Death is the card of becoming. It signifies an imminent and difficult transition, the conclusion of one phase of life and the beginning of another. Inevitably, something gets lost during the transformation, but something else will rise and take its place." End quote. And where do we find the card for death? Why, just outside Embers, the point of no return, the beginning of the end of the game, where we transition into whatever we become in any of the four endings. I mean, obviously, we have this big pop-up saying, "Careful, this is a point of no return," but thematically having this graffiti on the side of the building also serves as a less invasive, more contextual clue as to what is to come. Something gets lost and something else will rise. I mean, again, that's an incredibly vague statement, but I think the most obvious way we can look at it is pretty literal. From this point on, no matter what we do, we are screwed. In order to survive, we will have to transform, either becoming an engram in Mikoshi or going with Alt. Not to do so will result in a somewhat delayed, but ultimately still imminent death. Getting onto the ending cards now, Temperance is found over at the Columbarium, where Johnny heads to pay respect to V at the end of the game if he keeps our body. And I think looking at this ending through the description on the card provides a somewhat unique take. Quote, "Temperance is the card of balance. It may symbolize self-restraint or the gradual shift towards a more mature state of equilibrium. Temperance is associated with being in control of oneself, as well as the desire to achieve inner peace." End quote. It's actually pretty interesting this. After all, this ending is achieved when V stops fighting the animalistic desire to survive, and they make their inner peace with the fact that they can't really be saved and look at it more objectively. They can't live in their body anymore, but Johnny can. A potentially long and very fruitful life, though who knows what Silverhand will end up doing. In the end, this is what would have happened anyway had we done nothing. This is what nature was striving towards, and this equilibrium is only achieved by giving into that. It goes back to what Alt says. All our efforts to get inside Mikoshi weren't for nothing, though all we did really get in the end was the right to choose. It also goes to show that victory and inner peace are not really the same thing. The Devil is not a card we can find around Night City, but this one is instead only unlocked after completing the Arasaka ending, having kept Takemura alive for some reason. It reveals itself inside the Rubik's Cube in a fairly jump-scare-ish fashion. The worst card then, found in the worst ending. It's described as, quote, "The devil is addiction, craving, and passion. He brings fame and fortune, but at the price of losing oneself to a world of material distractions. The devil lures unsuspecting souls into traps, but always grants them a choice. One can try their luck and take him up on his offer, but one should always know when to call it quits." End quote. Yeah, so basically the devil just stands for everything which makes that ending the worst in the game. The fact that we choose to side with Hanako out of desperation, only to wind up bringing about a new world order of the Arasaka Empire, something which likely would have been toppled from within by Yorinobu if we just left him to it. We make a deal with the devil, and the world pays the price. And in the end, we don't even really get what we were promised, instead being forced again to choose between freedom and death, or survival and imprisonment. Though perhaps that also ties into the always being granted a choice part. Misty also warns us in multiple readings beforehand that the devil means subjugation, winding up under the influence of powerful people with unclear motives. Sounds again a lot like Hanako, and by a wider extension, Arasaka. Now, the tower, believe it or not, is actually found at Arasaka Tower, though interestingly, it's not inside the building itself, but rather amidst the ruins of the old one, the one which Johnny nuked in 2023. Let's figure out maybe why that is. Quote, "The tower is an omen of radical change, chaos and destruction. The lightning striking the tower signifies a return to the old order that lies buried under the ruins, and a new order that will rise from it. It is a symbol of tragedy, apocalypse, and self-destruction." End quote. Now, there's two ways of looking at this, I think. Firstly, obviously, the old tower was destroyed amidst chaos and destruction, and from those ruins Arasaka rose again. But Saburo himself also does the same in the devil ending, in what is ultimately a total tragedy where Yorinobu's mind is destroyed by his father. Equally, it could just represent the final battle in the game in all its forms at the tower, with Misty saying this about it.
The tower. You and everyone around you will experience a great shock. When the tower falls, nothing will be the same again. Nothing at all.
Now, my favourite ending, the star, is located at the camp by the solar arrays, where we meet with the Aldecaldos for that ending. And this description, I think, reinforces the fact that this ending is the most positive and hopeful. Quote, "The star is the card of hope. In the darkest of nights, there is a light that shines the path to home. The star is inspiration, motivation, and gives us strength to move forward." End quote. Again, easily the most positive on the list. I feel like the star ending is the only one where we're truly at peace, where after all of our fighting, we get to ride off into the sunset and get our reward. Sure, the sun is a pretty positive one also, with us winding up at the top of our game, but there still we are fighting desperately to stay alive, ending the game just before one of the most daring assaults in history. The only time we as V actually move forward from the trials of the main game is in the star ending, and further to that, the star is the third card Misty draws from the Temperance credits, representing, I think, the entirety of Johnny's journey, the Hanged Man being his old life, the Magician being his role as mentor, and the star being him finally moving on from it all to, hopefully, greener pastures. The moon is mystery. At least that's what Misty says when she draws it for Johnny at the start of the endings. Makes sense, the fate he goes on to with Alt is entirely unclear. Equally, I think something can be said for where we find the moon graffiti, right outside the Arasaka residence, where we rescue Hanako at the start of the devil ending. Here's what it says, quote, "The moon reminds us that reality is not always what it seems at first glance. In a world of appearances and illusions, the best course is often charted by one's own intuition. The moon is also the card of dreams, desires, and of course sleep, death's nightly ritual." End quote. First bit works. After all, reality certainly isn't what it seems for this ending, though the own intuition part, well, by the time we wind up here, it's a little late for that. We're locked into a Saburo-serving hell until the very end now. Misty also says this about the moon, which I think changes the take on it completely.
The moon.
Oh, that doesn't sound too bad, right?
I don't know, V. The moon is mystery.
So maybe the moon is clarity. I mean, there's no denying our goals become clearer once we reach this place, but again, it's a tough one. Equally, the graffiti actually has some text on this one, saying quote-unquote, wolves only howl at night. Yeah, not gonna lie, I don't really have any idea how to interpret this one. All this stuff around it seems pretty random and isn't pointing to any kind of definitive meaning for me. Like, who is the wolf in this scenario? Is it us and we say need to face difficulty to achieve glory? But then why is it outside the Arasaka residence? Equally, the moon could just be in direct contrast to the sun, signaling an unknown fate as opposed to straight up victory. And yes, there is no doubt, the sun is victory, located at the base of the massive apartment that we get in the sun ending, and reading, quote, "The sun symbolizes success. It is a card of freedom, renewal, and a bright future that lies ahead. The sun also represents truth, for its light will always pull back the curtain of shadow that hides the world's secrets. It also represents greatness and splendor," end quote. Now, let's just first talk about how cool this card looks, appearing like a cowboy-esque figure riding a motorbike off into the sunset. I mean, if you're going for connotations of freedom, then yeah, that fits pretty well. And even though in the sun ending it isn't entirely clear what's going to happen, after all, we take on a job for Mr. Blue Eyes whose intentions are shady to say the very least, there's still, I think, the very real possibility now that V could succeed in this insane mission and get their life back, somehow. Greatness and splendor? Yes, obviously. And let's not also forget that the sun is the final card Misty selects for the star ending, claiming we've got a good life out in the Badlands, and making that also an ending of success. Now, the second of the two cards which can't be found out in the world, Judgment, is instead unlocked during any of the other endings aside from the Devil. It's in the room where we defeat Adam Smasher, and yes, from reading the description, it again enforces the fact that any other ending is better than the Devil. Quote, "Judgment is the card of renewal. The angel blowing into the horn heralds resurrection and liberation. This card foretells an important change that will result in healing or fulfillment. It is also a symbol of self-worth," end quote. Indeed, this card highlights all the good things about the endings where we take matters into our own hands. Resurrection for us or Johnny, liberation for the other. We ultimately fulfill our goal, and even though the outcome isn't entirely what we wanted, that level of self-worth still shines through. Again, as Alt says, we've earned the right to choose, and by going with Arasaka instead, we don't have that. Johnny is forcibly removed from our head and then we die or get imprisoned anyway. I think Judgment cropping up here, of all places, is to serve as reassurance that we have proven worthy of taking on this megacorp by our own terms. Equally, with the artwork of the angel heralding liberation, I think perhaps that's representing Alt here, with the bodies walking towards it being those trapped by Soulkiller, now able to walk free alongside her in whatever reality they're gonna wind up in. I don't know, there is something a little creepy about that, but we'll dive more into Alt in a future video. Now, onto the last card. It's fitting, I suppose, that this one should crop up right before we make arguably the biggest decision in the game. This one reads, quote, "The world lies at the end of the Fool's long and winding journey. Wiser and more world-weary than he started out, the Fool faces a moment of reckoning. Some of us accept where our journey has led us to, while others embark on a new challenge. One thing in this world is certain, you can't have it all." End quote. I mean, yeah, V is definitely wiser at this point, having played through the game, doing all the main quests, and just prior to this having the freedom to complete whatever side quests and gigs we wanted to as well, but no matter what we do, we always end up here, the end of our journey. And maybe the accepting part points to the path of least resistance, calling it quits rather than inflicting more bloodshed. Though I think it's a slightly more uplifting interpretation to be generally accepting that all of our decisions have led us here, and now it's time for one final effort, for better or worse. And the can't have it all part? Well, yeah, there's multiple options. The only way to actually have it all is multiple playthroughs. Canonically, all this stuff can't happen in one singular reality, though it can happen if you just play the game a whole bunch. I think ultimately, being up on this roof, all this card serves as is acknowledgement of our efforts so far, and is representative of the decision we're about to make. So that's all the cards looked at and analysed in accordance with their respective locations, but a big question still remains. What the hell do they all mean? And why the hell are we seeing them in the first place? Misty seems to think it's a sign from a higher power, whilst Victor suggests it's the biochip messing with our brain and the solution is just to get rid of it. Mind you, we still see the Devil card even with the biochip gone, which probably suggests Arasaka didn't do a great job in removing it. But back to Misty's point. This world ain't exactly teeming with higher powers in the traditional sense, but she could still be onto something. After all, there are some pretty incredible feats of technological power seen here and there. I mean, Alt, for example, is practically an AI god at this point, but we do still see the tarot cards before we meet her, so maybe not. Equally, it could have something to do with the Zen Master. There's an email about him in Misty's shop, and he is the next closest thing to this more mystical themed quest. Thing is, if the tarot graffiti is tied directly to the biochip and Johnny can see it, that doesn't exactly go with the Zen Master, whom Johnny can't see. So again, who the hell put them there? Who has the foresight and understanding of the game's events to plot these into thematically fitting locations to warn us and foreshadow events to come? Could Jackie have siphoned a part of himself into the chip before he died? His love of Misty, allowing him to surface within our subconscious in the form of thematically appropriate tarot cards? It's a nice idea with absolutely no evidence to back it up. Equally, we can definitively say in this context that they do have some more grounding. With all of them gathered, Misty is able to predict the game's 4 endings. Or equally, she could just be picking names which the endings themselves are then being attributed to via what is the most accurate description. After all, it seems the only higher power with a thematical understanding of events from V's perspective would be the developers themselves. So unless this entire quest is a major 4th wall break, I'm pretty stumped as to how the biochip decides where we see these cards. So honestly, for a complete lack of another theory that works, that's what I'd say the Fall on the Hill quest is. A 4th wall break where the devs are attempting to warn us as players of certain characters' intentions, and subtly, creatively foreshadow different events to come based on our decisions. In the end, these things are designed to be open-ended, interpretable in 100 different ways so that you can read them and relate them to whatever is important to you at the time. Of course, they're able to have more weight in the game since every possible future is predetermined, and clearly by thinking about where they're found, we know there ultimately has been, or will be, an event there of significance to the meaning of that card. So finally, there's one important thing left to do here, and that is to hear from you guys. After all, these things are supposed to be interpreted, so go on, interpret away. I've laid a fair amount of groundwork here to go off of, so no doubt with your help, we'll be able to draw even more interesting conclusions to these. So, which of these cards do you think have the most interesting meanings and why? I look forward to reading your theories. As always, a huge thanks to all the supporters over on Patreon for all the ways you help the channel. Pledges, of course, but also all the nice and very often helpful messages and suggestions that you send my way. And of course, finally, thank you all for watching. I'm Bram, and I'll see you soon in another video.